I'm going to go over how to make a simple leaf that's fairly low poly using vertices that you draw yourself instead of using an actual shape as your starting point. First thing I usually do is just delete the default cube, so that's just X while it's selected. Again, right click to select. I'm going to head over to my outliner and I'm going to turn off the original collection that just has the camera and the light so that they're out of the way while I'm modeling. I'll turn them back on later. And I'm going to right click on the scene collection to make a new collection. I always like to name this descriptively in case I need to reuse my models later on so it's easier to figure out what's what. And I have this active. Double clicking to rename. Blue highlight means that it's active. Now I want to make sure that I'm adding a starting object into the very center of the grid. If the pivot point is off to the side, you just want to use Shift S for snapping, cursor to world origin, and then Shift A for the add menu, and you can use whatever you want. I'm just going to add a plane for the starting point, and I'm going to head into edit mode, so I can either press the tab key or I can come over and manually choose from the mode menu up here. And at this point, all I need for the plane is to have an empty object, so I'm actually just going to press X and I'm going to delete all of those vertices. That leaves me just the plane as an empty object with this little origin in the middle. I'm going to press 7 so that I'm looking straight down, and I'm going to make just the left side of my leaf to start, starting by going up through the middle. So wherever I want the bottom of the stem to be, I'm going to control left click. That shortcut is only going to work properly if you have right click to select enabled. And then wherever I want the top of my leaf to be, it's going to be control left click. And I'm going to start forming the side of my leaf, but I'm going to add a modifier first. So the wrench icon, add modifier. I'm going to search for mirror, and it's mirroring across the x-axis right now. So when I make another vertex, maybe about over here, you can see a new edge is being formed on the other side because it's mirroring across the x-axis, though it's not actually literally forming the geometry, so I can't select anything on the right and I don't see the vertices on the right. And I'm just going to continue this process. So whatever I want my leaf to look like, control left click when I want a new vertex. You'll notice that it's connected to an edge to whatever was selected last, so I do want to be a little bit careful about that. Control left click, and I'm just going to form whatever shape I want for my leaf. And I'm not going to connect all the way to the edge yet, but maybe something like this. Now, once I get to this stage, if I'm like, I'm not really thrilled with some of the positions, maybe I want this to end a little bit lower so the leaf itself isn't too long. Maybe I like that shape, or maybe I want to come in and make some adjustments to the other vertices as a response. Sort of a matter of personal preference. What do you want the silhouette of your leaf to look like? I'm going to switch back to the selection tool just so that the widget for moving is out of the way. And now I'm going to start working on creating the faces from my vertices. But I want to be really strategic. If I select everything and make a face, it's going to create something called an n-gon, where I have more than 4 vertices. And that can be problematic for a lot of different activities. Like, you can't use n-gons for faces that are on objects that are going to be 3D printed. And then there are a lot of tools that won't work at all if there's an n-gon in the area where you're trying to use it. So you want to be really careful to avoid n-gons unless you have no other option. So in this case, I definitely do. So I'm going to be forming my own faces, and wherever I want another vertex to be, I'm just going to right click off to the side to get deselected. I'm going to add control left click to create a group of 4 vertices. Because I have the select tool active, I can just click and drag to select my group of 4. F to make a face. I do want to be careful. If I make another face while I have all of these vertices selected, they're going to end up connected to the new vertex. So that's just something to watch out for. So I'm just going to right click just on the bottom, control left click, select, F to make a face. Always strategic about what vertex is active. I can also hold down on Shift and right click to select the vertices, F to make a face. And I'm going to be going this direction as well. Groups of 4, F to make a face. One other selection method I can do is pressing C for brush select, and if I drag my finger on the mouse, I can make the brush bigger or smaller. So I can just click and drag to sort of brush across, or just click over all of them at once, right click to get out of the brush, F to make a face. And so I'm just going to keep repeating this process using whatever selection method works best at the time. And that's what I was talking about. If you're not careful about what's selected, you can end up with all this geometry that you don't actually want. So I'm just going to Command Z to undo that. I'm going to be a little bit more careful about what's selected here. Control, left click, shift clicking to select, F to make a face. Now, before I move any further, I need to add some geometry across the edge in the middle, because otherwise it's just going to create a huge n-gon, and I don't want that. I'm going to switch to edge select. I can either press 2 at the top of the keyboard or manually change over here. So I'm just going to right click to select that middle edge. I'm going to go back to vertex select, so it's 1 on the top of the keyboard, or just clicking over here. And I'm going to press W to subdivide. Again, it'll be a different shortcut if you don't have right click to select. And I'm just going to play around with however many vertices I think are going to be necessary to create my groups of 4 vertices. So it might be 5, it might be 6, it might be 7. This is going to be very variable for everybody depending on the number of vertices that you have created. I'm going to start here. I can always move or add additional vertices a little bit later on if I need to. Now I'm going to go back to selecting groups of 4 to make my final faces, F to make a face. Now, if there are vertices where I'm not really happy with the placement, like this one might be a little bit too low, something really cool I can do is I can press G to grab and then G again, and it locks the movement along that particular edge. So that can allow me to be a little bit more precise with where I'm sliding something. Now, if we look over here, I have a little bit of a problem right now because I have 5 vertices instead of just 4. So I'm going to want to be a little bit careful about what I do over here. So I can select this group of 4, F to make a face. I think I'm actually going to slide this vertex up to make that space a little bit bigger, but I still have just 3 vertices. So I'm going to select this one edge, W to subdivide, back to vertex select. Now I have this new group of 4, F to make a face, and that gives me the entire leaf. Before I make it a little bit more 3-dimensional, I'm going to add a little bit more of a stem. First of all, I'm going to select everything with A, and I'm just going to slide just a little bit off to the side to give myself some room to add a stem. Now I'm going to use one of the selection methods, whichever one makes sense, to select the vertices that make up that right side. Right click to get out of the brush if you need to, E to extrude, X to lock that along the X axis, and then left click wherever you're happy with the location. Now if I take a look a little bit closer, you can see that there's a gap here. It might be that I just need to keep adjusting the location. I can also adjust individual vertices if some of them aren't quite in the right spot, or I can come to the mirror modifier and adjust the mirror itself to sort of meet together in the middle. So you can sort of experiment with what looks best as far as that goes. A few different ways you can achieve it. Now I want to make this look 3-dimensional. So I'm going to go Control Option Q to switch into quad view. This gives me a view of the top, a view of the front, a view of the right, and just a manual view that I can sort of mess around with and set however I want it to be. And I'm going to select just the vertices on the end here, and I'm going to turn on proportional editing, which is this little icon right here. You can also press O on your keyboard to toggle that on and off. Proportional editing is pretty cool. You can drag the little handle here and just move your finger on the mouse while you're dragging to control how much is actually moving. Sometimes this is easier if you just press G, and then I want to lock this to the Z axis, so Z. And before I left click to keep it, if I drag my finger up, I can make the circle of influence bigger. If I drag my finger down, I can make it smaller so that either more or less is moving as I'm moving what's selected. And so I'm just going to do this to get an interesting shape three-dimensionally for my leaf. So same thing over at the end, selecting the vertices there. And I might do a couple of different moves. So maybe down like this, but then a little bit back up with a smaller amount to get just a little bit of a more interesting curve. You can sort of experiment with what looks right as far as that goes. And yours doesn't have to look exactly like mine, but just something that's a little bit more three-dimensional. I'm going to switch back out of quad view, so Control Option Q, and I'm just going to head over to the very tip here, and I'm going to slide with proportional editing off probably that vertex just a little bit up. I might move this one a little bit inward so that the stem is starting to get a little bit narrower as it gets up there, but maybe something like this. So I'm going to, I think at this stage, apply the mirror modifier. I need to go in object mode to do that. And I'm just going to apply the modifier. And I want my stem to have some thickness, but if I try to do that now, I'll end up with the back side looking sort of distorted and not how I want it. So I need to give the entire leaf a little thickness first to be able to work with the stem. So add modifier, I'm going to search for solidify, which we've used before. And you can experiment, I'm just going to take a look at this in edit mode for a moment, with what you want to do in terms of simple or complex. Sometimes you'll find that one gives you a better result than the other. Sometimes you'll find that the default size, like 0.01, is absolutely perfect. Sometimes you want it a little bit bigger, depending on the scale that you're working on. Or maybe I actually need it to be significantly thinner. So I can sort of just either type a number or click and drag to experiment with the amount of thickness. I want to have just enough thickness so that I can see that it's there without the leaf itself getting too thick, because leaves do have a very slight amount of thickness, almost like paper. But I don't want to go too heavy-handed with that either. Again, you might get a slightly different look between simple and complex, so see what gives you the best result. I think I'm going to leave this like this, and I'm going to head back into object mode to apply the modifier. Now in edit mode, the geometry has been added, and I'm going to work on actually making the stem be a little bit thicker. I'm going to want to be in edge selection mode for this, so 2, or I can click, and I'm just going to select everything that's making up the edge, so shift, right click to either add or remove from the selection. And I'm just going to pull on the blue handle to make this just a little bit taller. So now you can see that there's a little bit of a point there. It's just getting a little bit more three-dimensional, and maybe I want it to be a lot more. Like, I can experiment with what I like the look of. Depends on how subtle you want this to be. And from here, I'm going to do some beveling. So Command B is the shortcut to bevel. And you can see, depending on how much I drag, I can sort of bevel this out. And I'm going to left click. There's also a little bevel menu over here. I can play around with how thick it is, the sort of shape, the number of segments, all sorts of different settings here, depending on what you want things to look like. I want to stick fairly low poly, so I only want one segment. So I think that looks pretty good. So just getting, again, a little more dimension to the stem there. I'm just going to minimize. Now, at this point, it's just a matter of any other adjustments you want to do. Maybe I want to come over and add an additional loop over here. I'm going to just go into wireframe for a little bit. Oh, and I want to be strategic about getting out of loop cut when I'm not using it. Maybe I want to scale these a little bit more. Maybe I want GG to slide these, so S to scale, G to move, GG to move along the current edges. So just getting that a little bit wider at the base. Um, Maybe there are areas that I want to go back in with proportional editing and making some changes so that now that the mirror modifier is off, things aren't perfectly symmetrical anymore. So maybe some things are going to come up or some things are going to come down. Just experimenting with what I like the look of so that there's a little bit of variation, not perfectly symmetrical like it was before. Now, I have the stem sort of thickened and beveled on the one side. If I really want to, I can do the same on the other. Totally a matter of personal preference. But at this point, I'm probably ready to start working with the lighting and with the materials. So I'm going to head into object mode. I'm going to turn on the original collection. I'm going to go over to my light, and actually before I go into the rendered view, I'm going to come to the camera icon and change the engine to cycles. Just a reminder, Eevee is really fast and it's good for quick previews, but it's not really accurate. I'm also going to come to the world settings, and I can either give myself a background color, or I can override the color, maybe with one of the sky textures. The sky textures can be pretty fun. You can really drastically change what they look like by adjusting the various settings. Particularly Nishida has the biggest customization. In this case, I'm just going to remove it and leave it as a solid color. Maybe a little bit brighter here. I can experiment. Now, my light is selected, so I'm going to come over to the light settings over here. I often like to use the sun, but in cycles, usually somewhere between 6 and 10 is going to give you the best strength. And just dragging on the little circle allows you to change where the light is shining at. So maybe something like that. I can keep experimenting until I'm satisfied with the angle. Again, for the sun, the location does not matter at all. It is just the angle of the light that matters. Now that I have my lighting set up, I'm going to make sure my leaf is selected. I'm going to come down to the materials, so this little red circle icon, plus new to create a material and material slot at the same time. And today I'm not going to use the principled BSDF like we did previously. I'm going to change the surface to a different type of shader. Now, my absolute favorite is the mix shader because it lets you combine different things together to make something that's a little bit more complex. So I'm just going to come over to my first shader where it says none. And I think I'm going to go with diffuse. It's just nice and soft. And my second shader where it says none, I'm going to go with glass so that it's a little bit transparent. So there are a lot of settings here that I can mess with. First of all, the factor determines which material takes precedence. So if I go all the way to 0, it's just my first material diffuse. If I go all the way to 1, it's just my second material glass. Anything in the middle is going to be some kind of combination of the two, and I can always come back here and mess with it a little bit later. Now my glass color, I'm just going to click on the color, choose some sort of green to use as a starting point, but I'm going to override my diffuse color with one of the generated textures here. I'm going to go with Vernoy. Now, all of these different generated textures have a huge number of settings that you can experiment and change the look of what it happens to be. Now, I want to keep sort of a low poly feel, so I don't really want the smooth one. I'll keep this one. I do want the scale to go down though, so these shapes get bigger. So again, sticking with a little bit more of a low poly feel instead of something that's more realistic. And lots of other settings I can experiment with. I'm going to leave the defaults in this case. So once I have my initial shaders set with my diffuse material, my glass material, or whatever combination you chose, and whatever texture you chose, at this stage I'm going to head over to shading, and I'm going to do something that's a little bit more complex. I want to actually have control over the colors that are there. Now, when I'm taking a look at the material preview or look dev, depending on the version of Blender, that's showing you the material without light impacting it. So I often like to keep this in the rendered view, even though it takes a little bit more processing, just because it's going to give me a more accurate view. Now on the bottom here, we have the node editor, and this lets us look at the different parts of the material itself. So the material output is what's connected to the actual model. You can see the mixed shader that's been added. You connected to the diffuse material with its texture, and my second material, glass, is underneath. So I can work entirely over here with the nodes if I want to. I'm just going to move this off to the side. All the same navigation techniques apply in terms of zooming in and out with Command or Control, just sliding on your mouse to pan, and so on. But I want to override the color from the texture where it connects to diffuse, so I'm going to use Shift-A for the Add menu. And I'm just going to search for something called Color Ramp. And Color Ramp lets you add a gradient. Notice how when I hover over the connection here, it turns to white. If I click when it's doing that, this gets connected, but I can also manually drag to the different sockets if that's something that I need to do. So I'm going to click on my different color dials. I'm going to change the black one to some sort of maybe darker green here. I'm going to change my white material to, I don't know, maybe a light sort of yellow. Notice that if I drag the dials themselves, the colors shift. I can click on plus to add additional dials, and when I have a dial that's active, I can set it to a different color. And so I can add as many what we call color stops as I want to start having more control over what's happening to the leaf here. And as I slide them around, you'll also notice things start to look a little bit different. Maybe I want one that's going a little bit more into the oranges. And so I can experiment. And this can be just an interesting way to end up with a material that's a little bit more complex. You'll notice I have the same settings for the Voronoi texture that I have over here. The color ramp actually got added as well. So I can continue to play around with the scale or the other settings on the amount of roughness. So all sorts of things that I can experiment with to control how this material is going to end up looking. And maybe you don't like the diffuse material with glass. Maybe you want to change it to something else, or maybe you want to change the factor so that one material is having more of an influence than the other, like maybe glass is too high right now, maybe it needs to be a little bit less. Experiment, try things out, try different textures. Maybe you don't want Voronoi, maybe you want something else. All sorts of different things that you can experiment with. So I could remove this or switch it to something else, like the wave texture can do some cool things, the noise texture, and so on. I'm just going to get out of there. I might want the stem to have a different material. So if I head over into edit mode and go to face select, I can start selecting faces, and I probably should go through the middle as well, using whatever selection method is helpful. And just going to get a little bit more zoomed in so I can be a little bit more accurate here. Shift drag on the mouse to pan, and shift click to select multiple, and command to zoom out. And maybe I'll do the same thing on the back side, or maybe I'll keep it the same. I can play around with that, but I can come over to my materials, plus to create a new material slot, plus new to create a new material, and then I can assign the selected faces to that new material. So maybe I don't want this one to be glass or diffuse. Maybe I want the stem to be a little bit glossy. Maybe I want it to just have a single color, so instead of a mixed shader, again, the glossy. Maybe I want it to be a little bit more going towards brown, or maybe it should be a darker green. I can experiment and play around until I'm satisfied with the end result. Now, when I'm completely satisfied and finished, I'm just going to switch back over to layout. I'm probably going to get out of the rendered shading and head back over to solid. I can also press C on the keyboard and change between the shadings that way. And I just want to line up my camera with where I want to look. I like to zoom out a little bit from what I actually want to see. View, align active camera to view, From here, I can right click on the edge, and if I switch just by pressing the period, not the one in the number pad, the other period, and switch to the 3D cursor, now I can have control over where the 3D cursor itself is located. And so I can sort of slide this around, experiment with the location. Once your camera view is all set, and your lighting and your materials, your world background, then it's time to render. So it's just like before, render, render image. You can see the time remaining over here. And when it gets all the way through the render, with cycles it does take a little bit longer, you can go to image, and then there'll be an option to either save or save as. Either one is completely fine, and just make sure to use our standard naming format. I'm just going to cancel this right here, but make sure you let yours render all the way through so you can turn that in Google Classroom. Don't forget to save your file. Choose a location that's easy to access. Make sure you give it a name. And save. And that's it for today.